Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. If you would stand for the reading of God's word. Matthew 27 to 30. Reading out of the NASB. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Amen. You may be seated. Obviously, I think everybody is privy to this text. Again, today we're going to be dealing with the law. We will be dealing with the law for the next couple of Sundays because of what Jesus preaches about. And today's message is specifically the law concerning adultery. I think adultery is an interesting topic. We would like to say in marriage, we call it infidelity. And infidelity is one of the topics that I feel like if you ask the average person, what is the one reason you would divorce your spouse? And most people would say adultery or infidelity, right? A lot of people would not be able to live with their spouse because of infidelity, because they feel like the trust has been robbed or it has been basically, it's left the building. And we want to deal with infidelity because Jesus here in verse 27 talks about it. And I do want to talk about it in the sense of, I have two headings. The law concerning adultery is found in verse 27. Excuse me. And Jesus concerning adultery is found in verses 28 through 30. So how does the law deal with adultery is what we're going to be dealing with in verse 27. And how does Jesus deal with adultery? So when you read here in verse 27, it's interesting, right? Like if you think about the context, right? Jesus starting in verse 21, we talked about that last week, right? We dealt with how people are to deal with each other in regards to relationships, right? We talked about reconciliation. We talked about forgiveness, how we are to forgive, right? How we are to reconcile, why we're to reconcile, the importance of reconciliation. We dealt with all of that last week. And it's interesting that as soon as Jesus talks about reconciliation, the first thing that he talks about is adultery. I thought that was like interesting. And then right after that, if you think about the section following in verse 31 through 33, he talks about divorce. So I thought that was pretty neat that we're talking about relationships. And then as soon as he talks about relationships, what causes relationships to decay? And not only does it decay, how people say, you know what, I'm going to end it. And it's interesting that Jesus is, in that sense, like he's thinking about it in a linear way, like progression. There's a progression. Like if relationships fall apart, usually between man and a woman, right? We're talking about here a man and a woman. Last week I talked about reconciliation between a brother, like your friend. It could even be your spouse, right? So if we thought about it in a linear way as far as like relationships go between a man and a woman, what that looks like, what is the cause of this decay, right? And the predominant thing in a relationship, if I were to ask you, if you are in a relationship or if you're in a marriage, what is the thing that would cause you to say, you know what, I can't be with this person anymore? Now, we could have a whole conversation about divorce, which is what we're going to be dealing with next week. But if I ask the average person, what is the breaking point of your marriage or of your relationship, most people are going to say, if my husband or my boyfriend cheated on me, or if my girlfriend cheated on me, like, it's over. And even going back to my favorite podcast that I listen again, I'm listening to it again because it's about a divorce lawyer, right? He's a divorce lawyer, so he's giving me insight from a secular standpoint that I don't really think about every day, right? But if you watch, if you listen, there's one part of it where a man and a woman is different, right? A man and a woman is different. If a man cheats on his wife asks him, what does she ask him? Do you love her? Do you love her? Right? And when a woman cheats on a man, he asks her, did you sleep with him? Right? It's two different questions. But if you think about the average person, that's what average people ask. Like, if you've ever had someone cheat on you, if you're, depending on what sex you are, you're going to ask that question. Because that's how women look at love, and that's how men look at love, right? That's how we define it in some sense, right? I'm not saying everybody's going to ask those questions, but predominantly, those are the questions that we ask. And if we're honest, right, as guys, that's what we're, in some sense, we're a little bit edgy about. We don't have the utmost confidence, right? We're afraid that our girlfriends might cheat on us or our husbands might cheat on us, and we have a little bit of insecurity about that. I remember that as a young 20s guy, and I remember getting to a fight with my ex-girlfriends because they said to me, hey, I'm going to go clubbing with my friends. And I'm like, why would you go clubbing with your friends? As I got older, I would say, don't call me. I'd be like, hey, you have your time, I have my time. Have a great time. But I remember early on, I would say like, hey, why would you go do that? And then the classical response is, it's not that I don't trust you, I don't trust them, right? That's the response that we have. But if we deep down inside, if we really think about it, it's not even that I don't trust them. There is a part of us where we don't trust our girlfriends or our husbands or our wives or our boyfriends. We have a lack of confidence in them as well, if we were deeply honest. And I want to deal with those topics because Jesus talks about adultery. And obviously adultery is infidelity. It's in some sense probably the most hurtful thing that a person can do to one another. And this week, we're going to be dealing with adultery, and next week, we're going to be dealing with divorce. It's an interesting thing because adultery is not, like, if you think about people who commit adultery, right? And I don't want us to say we're going to commit adultery or, people who have committed adultery. I don't think anybody who commits adultery wakes up that morning and says, hey, today I'm going to commit adultery and I'm going to ruin X amount of years of marriage with this person. I don't think anybody wakes up with that mindset. Like, today I'm going to do this and I'm going to pull the trigger and I'm going to throw away 15 years of my marriage or 20 years of my marriage, right? What we understand, what Jesus is saying here is that adultery is something that happens in the heart, right? Because he says, anyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart, right? Adultery is not like the logical end of adultery is not the committing of adultery. The committing of adultery happens way before you actually commit it. And this is something that we want to make sure that we're conscious of. And the other part that I want you to be conscious of is that people don't commit adultery if they're satisfied. Okay? Let's hash that out, right? People don't look other places if they're content with where they are at now. Think about that concept in every category of your life, right? Think about it in your job. Why would I look for another job if I love the job that I have? It pays me well. It gives me good benefits. I have a great employer. I have great employees. I have great perks. I have great everything. Why would I look elsewhere? Right? Think about it obviously we're going to look at it from a relationship standpoint, but think about it not only in that sense, but think about it in every category of your life, whether it be your job, your marriage, right? Whatever it is. If you're content, there's no reason to look elsewhere. But it's when you feel dissatisfaction, right? That's when we start to look elsewhere. And this is something for us to very much consider. Am I satisfied as a person? Am I satisfied as a husband, as a wife, in my marriage? Am I satisfied as a boyfriend or a girlfriend? And then in a spiritual sense, am I satisfied in Christ? Right? Is Christ truly my all in all? Is he truly the bedrock and the foundation? Am I looking to something else because I found my satisfaction in Christ? That's the question that we want to ask. Because when I look at that idea of adultery, spiritual adultery is the same thing, right? Read the book of Hosea. That gives you a good picture of what spiritual and true adultery looks like and the way God deals with it. So it's interesting that in verse 27, Jesus opens it the same way or in a more concise way in verse 27 as he did with verse 21, right? He says in verse 21, you have heard the ancients were told, and then he says the commandment, which is the sixth commandment. And here in verse 27, he uses a more concise method where he says what the law says in verse 27, and then he says in verse 28 how he thinks about it or his stance on it. And what we see is Jesus is now giving his intention or his thoughts about how people have understood this, right? Specifically, I want to give you a more historical background because a lot of people are, if you read 27, 28, we read the Ten Commandments. I don't know if you remember history from elementary school and middle school. But if you read the Ten Commandments, people say what about the Ten Commandments? If you listen to what secular people say, they're going to say that the Ten Commandments is a derivative of Hammurabi's Code. If you remember Hammurabi's Code, he was the sixth king of the Babylonian Empire. He was somewhere, people say he's usually from 1790 BC to about 1700 BC, roughly about, and that he lived a pretty long life at that time. And he wrote a code of 282 laws in Hammurabi's Code that basically give you civil, moral, fiscal laws that actually have a lot of influence even in the United States. And people say because Hammurabi's Code was written around 1790 BC, and the Ten Commandments was roughly around 1400 or 1450, depending on how you date it, they say that Hammurabi's Code is older. Therefore, and Hammurabi's Code was the first code that actually wrote an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So the Bible deals with an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth in Exodus 24. And they say, look, the Bible stole from Hammurabi's code. Now, I do want to kind of give you some insight on that because it does affect the way people think. But the Bible in no way takes from Hammurabi's code. Why do I say that? Because we read the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments doesn't deal with fiscal, social ideas. The Ten Commandments deal with God's divine plan and God's divine moral, ethical plans for mankind. It doesn't deal with social, it doesn't deal with like a day-to-day, one-to-one thing as much, right? There is elements of it, but it's more pertaining to the heart, right? The Ten Commandments is dealing with the heart. Do not murder. Do not covet. Do not commit adultery. Why are you doing those things is what God is concerned about. Not so much of, if you do these things, here are the fees that you have to pay, which is what Hammurabi's code deals more with. And that's something that we as Christians have to have a kind of a clear understanding, because a lot of secular people are going to say, look, the Bible is it's a written book, but it's written by men, and it can't really be taken seriously because it steals from literature from ancient Near Eastern literature, and it has a little bit of everything. If you read historians and you read secular historians as you go to college and you take history, they talk about this type of information, and people who don't know or are misinformed will buy into it and be like, you know what? That makes a lot of sense, and you know what? I can't really take the Bible seriously. That's a lot of hogwash, and if you really do your study and you actually do, you're honest about it, you can actually see the inconsistency in those arguments. So I kind of want to give you that idea. I want to paint that picture for you to recognize that there is Jesus dealing with the law and what the law is and how it is historically, and even in Jesus' time. And I want to lay that foundation for you, and I want to lay that background for you because of the magnitude of what Jesus is saying here in verse 27. If you read it as an American today, right? You shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. We look at that and we're not blown away by that standard or that statement, right? We just say, that's common sense, right? Even an unbeliever would know to a certain extent that you shouldn't do things like this, all right? But why is this statement so huge? Because if you understand historically, even going back to the Roman Empire and you go even back to the Greek Empire, if you just do even a Google check on it, you would recognize that there was a hierarchy, right? Patriarchy was a real thing, right? Patriarchy was a real thing even in the Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament, right, and you look at the standard of the law when a man cheats versus a woman cheating, right? Even today, if a girl sleeps around with multiple men, there's a derogatory term that we refer to her as. If a man were to go around and sleep with multiple women, we compliment him, right? We don't call him a negative. I don't really know of a negative term you would call a guy if he sleeps around with a lot of girls. Most guys in a secular view would be like, wow, man, how is he able to do that? Man, I wish I could figure that out, right? We actually put them on a pedestal and we say, wow, that guy has, he has game, right? But if a woman were to do that, we call her negative words. Why do we do that? Because if you go back into history, it was the same thing. If you go back to the Greek Empire, you go back into the Roman Empire, women who cheated were sometimes put to death. Men who cheated were given a fine. Sometimes the fine was so inconsequential that men would keep cheating. Right? Look at movies. Watch your movies that deal with Roman Empire, like whether it be like, I don't want to say it, but I thought the sitcom, I don't know if it's a sitcom, but the series on HBO called Rome, I don't know if you've ever watched it, but it was probably one of the best shows I've ever watched. It's very, I'm not gonna say anything, but it's very secular. There's a lot of like sex and nudity and everything else that, shows nowadays. I think shows nowadays are even worse, but back then I thought it was good enough, that the story was good enough, but I thought it gave a really good historical background. It gave you a good understanding of how people lived during that empire. And like it helps you to understand like the difference between the way men lived and the way women lived. So think about that idea, that concept of women are held to this standard of if you sleep around, you will be killed, versus a man where it's like, hey, we're going to fine you $1.50. All right, that's it. All right, I'll pay the fine and I'll move on with life. But when you read Jesus, he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And he says to what? He says that everyone who looks at a woman. Now, if you take everyone to mean even a woman looks at a woman and commits lust, like we're now in LGBTQ territory. So what we're going to define everyone is every man. Okay? Every man who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This is a groundbreaking statement because now he's addressing that men should not commit adultery. In a social front, men committing adultery was okay. Historically, it's been proven that it's normal. It's the norm. But what Jesus is doing here is he's equaling the plane. He's saying men and women are equal. You shouldn't commit adultery. Just because you're a man doesn't give you the right to commit adultery. If you think about that, Jesus is elevating women. It's interesting because I was reading about this idea of adultery. If you go to Britannica, and this is written by secularists, secularists write Britannica Encyclopedia. I don't know if you were old enough, but every household used to have Britannica. Okay, every house. I had Britannica and World Book. If you're old enough, you know what World Book Encyclopedia is. But now, encyclopedias don't exist. All of them went bankrupt, and now all of them made an online page, or if you want to really look at encyclopedias, you use Wikipedia, right? But it's interesting that Britannica had a thing about adultery, and I was reading it yesterday. And actually what they say is, they wrote that the term adultery implies that this is distinctly a Judeo-Christian and Islamic attitude toward marriage. It causes many anthropologists to be cautious using the term for other contexts. So if you really think about it, adultery is more a religious term than a general term. That secularists don't really look at adultery as something that's bad. And it's interesting that, like, if you really think about that, the reason why adultery is bad is because ultimately A marriage is not just a promise to your spouse, right? A marriage is a covenant that you make to God with this person, which is why I appreciate Britannica saying, hey, adultery is a Christian term that applies only to Christians or even Muslims, because Muslims would look at adultery as you murder the person who commits adultery, especially a woman, right? But if you look at the reason why extremists, and this is what we talk about, extremists like Islam and extremists, adultery is fair game. And when you think about all of these things and you look at the way people think, even today, people have the same view. We have the same view. Like, we think that it's okay on a certain point. We understand when men commit adultery. But if a woman were to commit adultery, we say, wow, what's wrong with her? And this kind of goes against the grain. What Jesus is saying here goes against the norm. Jesus is saying it's never okay for anybody to commit adultery, let alone in your in your society now. It's frowned upon that women would commit adultery. What I'm telling you is that it's not okay for men to commit adultery. No one should commit adultery. And you should think, men there who are listening to Jesus, they're appalled. Like, you're saying it's not okay for me to commit adultery? Because when you think about it, one of the main arguments that people talk about, and secularists have accused me of, is, well, do you believe in polygamy then? Because polygamy happened in the Old Testament, right? I thought a marriage is between a man and a woman. How can a man be married to 1,000 wives? Look, Solomon committed adultery. And those are questions that Christians really have to deal with seriously. If an unbeliever were to come up to you and say, do you believe in polygamy? What would be your stance? These are questions that Christians really have to deal with and be an adult about, and actually have a conviction and an answer to those questions. Like, how do we deal with Old Testament saints that had more than one wife? I mean, isn't that why Mormonism is so attractive? And these are the things that Christians have to deal with. And I want you to be honest. And if you say, you know what, I really don't know how a Christian is supposed to deal with polygamy, that's a good position. Like, we can talk about it. We can work through it. I think there's a good biblical position as to why we don't hold to polygamy. But if you don't know the answer, those are things for you to find out about. You shouldn't just say, well, I don't know. I don't think that's a good answer. And if you don't know, I think it's a healthy thing for you to actually seek answers. So here, in Jesus, what Jesus talked about in verse 27 and 28, he actually responds and he says, anybody who looks upon a woman has committed adultery in his heart. I want us to think about what Jesus is saying here, because here in verse 28, he uses two words that are very important in the way we understand it. First, every man who looks at a woman with lust. If I ask you, what is lust? What would you say? When we say that a man or a woman is lusting, how would we explain that? And I want you to understand what lust is. Because the 10 Commandments actually gives you an answer to it. If you were following along and reading along with David as he was reading the 10 Commandments, this is the reason why I had us read the 10 Commandments. Because if you read the 7th commandment, now there isn't a number in the 10 Commandments, so you probably have to count the Ten Commandments, and if you didn't memorize which commandment it was, then you know that the seventh commandment is do not commit adultery. It's the seventh commandment. The last commandment, the 10th commandment, is verse 17, which is you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's property, right? And when you look at you shall not commit adultery, the way Jesus or the way God defines adultery, you shall not commit adultery is you shall not covet, which is you shall not lust for or desire inappropriately. That's the language. So the way Jesus answers or the way God answers adultery is by coveting. The way Jesus explains it in the New Testament, especially here in verse 28, is shall not lust. So it's interesting that Jesus answers the question of do not commit adultery with the 10 commandments by saying the 10th commandment as lusting. So when I looked at what is lusting, I looked at lust as something that is antithetical to love. Because when you think about lust, what is it to lust? When we lust after something or someone, what are we actually doing? We're thinking in our minds that I want that. And I will do whatever I can, or I will do whatever I want to get that. That's lusting. If I take a more dictionary answer to it, it's the dehumanization of another person or an object for our own passion, leading us to act as if it were a visual or emotional prostitute for our own use. So what we do is we dehumanize another individual or another object so that we can gratify ourselves. The reason why I say that it's antithetical to true love, because true love doesn't dehumanize another person. True love is the opposite of that. It's the building and the encouraging of another person. It's the humanizing of another person. And if you think about if you think about Christ's love for you, he gives you life. He doesn't dehumanize you and take away your life. He actually brings you to life. He loves you and he empowers you. He strengthens you. He seeks what is best for you. Whereas lust is the complete opposite of that. Lust does not seek the best for you. It seeks the best for me. And when you think about how the world views lust and the way the world views love, some people will say they're symmetrical. That some people say that you need to have a healthy balance of lust and love. I've actually listened to a psychologist say that. But what Jesus is saying is, it's the opposite. You can't have lust for somebody and love them. Because lust is always going to be about me, what I want. And it has nothing to do with you. Because you're not more important than me. And if you think about a marriage that's built upon that concept of I'm more important than you, how far will that marriage go? It won't. Which is why you look at the divorce rate in the United States now. it's over 50%. And they're projecting by 2030, it's going to reach somewhere between 60 to 65%. Brother, we're 5 years away from that. We're 5 years away from marriages going up somewhere from 4 to 10%. Where if you look at young people today, what do young people today say? I don't even want to get married. Most young people are not even willing to get married. Why? Because it's not worth it. The pros don't outweigh the cons. Why? Because I have my pornography. I don't need to get married. Why do I have to deal with people when all I have to do is sleep around and I have my pornography and I don't have to be committed? If you think about the society that we're living in, it's pushing for this. It's telling you that lust is better than love. Lust is a completely compatible substitute for love. And even Christians are buying into it. Why? Because I don't want to sacrifice. I don't want to live for another person. I don't want to live for my spouse. I don't want to be held accountable. I don't want that responsibility. I just want to live for myself because that's it. That's enough problems that I have. And this is why Jesus is saying here that it's not something that it just happens overnight. This is a thought process that you deal with and you work with and you come to a conclusion and say, you know what? I'm too important. It's not worth it. But what Jesus is saying in verse 29 and 30, which is so helpful, because he says, if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it down, throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Then he says the same thing in verse 30, and he says, not only is it your right eye, but now it's your right hand. Why is it? Like, if you read this, it makes sense, right? Verse 29 makes sense. Verse 30 it doesn't make any sense. Why? Verse 29 is talking about your right eye. Why? Because in 28 and 27, if you looked upon a woman with lust, how do you look upon a woman without your eyes? It makes logical sense. Why is he all of a sudden talking about your right hand? And it makes all the left-handed people feel left out. Right? If you're a lefty, I feel bad for you. Is Jesus trying to play favorites? Is he discriminating left-handed people? Because when you think about the right eye, he's saying if your right eye or your right hand, he's talking about it in a sense that, generally speaking, most people are right-handed. And the right side of their body is their dominant side. And when you look at what Jesus is talking about, he's saying, if that part of your body that is the dominant part of the body, which is the important part of the body that helps you do tasks, he's saying, if that part of the body causes you to stumble, tear it off. Now, is Jesus propagating mutilation? Is Jesus telling us to start cutting off parts of our body if it causes us to sin? I mean, is Jesus, okay, here's a joke, okay? Is Jesus the first jigsaw? I mean, I've read an article where secularists were actually advocating that Jesus was promoting self-mutilation. And I'm thinking to myself, how do you have a PhD? And the better question is, why do you have a PhD? As I was like studying this, and I was like kind of reading what like secular people were talking about, and I'm reading this nonsense of like, look, the Bible is promoting you to hurt yourself. And I'm like, really? Obviously, Jesus is not talking about that. So what is he actually saying? Right? What is Jesus saying when he says, your right hand makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you? If your right hand causes you, cut it off. I do want to take you to Matthew chapter 18, verse 1 through 6. Because in Matthew chapter 18, verse 1 through 6, it kind of gives you the foundation. Because Matthew chapter 7 through 9 is Jesus literally repeating Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 through 30. Because in 7 through 9, he talks about stumbling blocks, for it is better that the stumbling blocks come, but woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it's better to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or to have 2 feet and be cast into eternal fire. So Jesus is actually giving you the same statement that he's saying here in Matthew 5 and 18. But chapter 18, verse 1 through 6 gives you the context. Why is Jesus talking about cutting your hands and your feet and everything else? Okay? If you read chapter 18, verse 1 through 6, the question that's raised in verse 1 is, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? We're talking about heaven. Who's going to be the greatest person in heaven? He calls a child onto him, and he says, truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. He's now talking about salvation. Okay? Unless you're like this child. The child literally meaning unless like you are dependent like a child and you are converted. Notice that. The word there is used for a conversion. It's talking about salvation. Unless you are a believer in Christ, you will not enter into heaven. Then he goes on to say in verse 3, 4, 5, and 6, he's talking about false teachers. So when you think about this idea of cutting off, what is Jesus actually saying here in Matthew 5? If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Right? It's like that famous book by John Owens, Mortification of Sin. If something in your body causes you to sin, take it away. Cut it off. Because what do you think? This is why people are offended by this kind of text. Why? Because people can't live with this idea that God died a painful death. He died on your behalf, and he's calling us to die. People today hate to talk about the wrath of God or the anger of God, the jealousy of God, and people only want to promote God who is gracious and loving, and he doesn't want to do anything bad to you, and he's really like Genie in the bottle, and he's Will Smith, and he wants the best for you. Right? Like people really view God as some God who's just he's just waiting for you, and he's waiting for your call. He's like your girlfriend that won't whine and nag at you. That's how some people view God. But the moment we start talking about death and God is calling you to cut your hand off and all of these types of language, we start to think, that's not a God that I serve. No, that is the God that you serve. He wants you to cut away things that will cause you to sin. Because what does sin do? Sin calls you and it causes you to sin more. And I'll end it with this. When I was a kid, I used to steal money. And when my mom would confront me, asking me, did you steal money? I would say to her, no, I didn't. when I did. But if you really think about that scenario, why am I lying? Because I stole and I knew it was wrong. How did I know it was wrong? Because I was told. God told me not to steal. And because I stole, what did I do? I try to cover up my sin with more sin. This is what God is calling you to do. He's saying, don't sin, and if there's anything that causes you to sin, throw it away. Cut it off. Because if you hold on to it, it's going to cause you to sin more. And that pertains to any sin. In our secular world today, what do we say? If you made a mistake, own up to it. Stop lying. Stop making excuses. If you did something wrong, admit it. Own it. And move on. That's the same thing that Jesus is saying. If you caused yourself to sin and someone asks you, say yes. And this is the beauty of the gospel. Can I just remind you the beauty of the gospel? Because when Satan accuses you and says, you are guilty of this, your answer should be, yes, you are right. I should not lie. If Satan says, you did X, Y, and Z, you should not say, no, I didn't. You should say, yes, I did. And Satan is going to say, well, then you're guilty. And you're going to say, yes, I am. You deserve to go to hell. Yes, I do. And at the end, you're going to say, but the thing that I believe is that Jesus died for my sin. And although I am guilty and I deserve hell, Jesus paid for my righteousness. And it's not what I did, or it's not what I am doing, or what I am about to do. It's what he's done that causes me to be free. And yet you can accuse me all day, and I will agree with you. And yet my Savior is the reason as to why I am going to heaven. And it is not because of my righteousness. It is because of his. That's the beauty of the gospel. That's what makes us all the same and yet totally different from unbelievers. It's not what I did. Because if it's about what I did, I'm just as guilty as you. But it's because what Christ has done that I'm free from my sin. I want us to marvel in that truth. I want us to stand and to say to your accuser, yes, you're right. Don't feel guilty about it. Own up to it. Admit to yourself, yes, I am that failure. But there is somebody on my behalf who has made me clean. And that is why, as I fail now, I'm going to try, because of my love and my affection for him, I'm going to live my life so that I live a life that is pleasing to him. I don't want to fail anymore. That's the Christian. And I want you to be encouraged. I want you to not look at your sin and say, oh, wow, I'm such a bad person. You are. Be honest. You are. But don't sit there and mope and cry about it. Look to Christ. Look to Jesus. Look at his saving work. And get back up and say, yes, I am this person, but he has redeemed me. And I will trust in him, and I'm going to continue to live my life for him. Let's close with prayer. Gracious God, we thank you.